No, that was 2 minutes. Great. So as we're gathering back, I also meant to say at the end of that session to thank Kevin McNally, who has given great assistance to our chairs in the sessions today. Kevin is leaving us now, but thank you very much, Kevin. And Orla Tracy will step in the Q&A session here to help us to keep an eye on the chat and everything. And Maeve will tell us a little bit more about that now, I think. So Maeve, if I can hand over to you for this final session. Thanks a million.
All right, thanks very much. And without wanting to sound like a record repeating, ha ha ha. I mean, it's just been a fantastic afternoon. I wasn't there in the morning, but it's been wonderful. And I'm delighted to see so many people still here late on a Friday afternoon now for the discussion, which I'm looking forward to, and I'm sure all of you are as well. So this is a kind of a roundtable discussion. We'll have 3 contributions from Helen Phelan, Olga Barry, and Yvonne Bonanfont as well. They'll be relatively short to give us lots of time for questions. And as has happened in the panel sessions up to now, we'll take questions and comments through the chat. Feel free to put those in as we go along. You don't need to wait. But we'll also throw open the floor to hear your voices. So you can raise your hand as well, or indeed Orla might indicate who has asked questions, or we'll find you and we'll ask you to unmute and ask those questions then directly as well. I'd just like to remind you to mute all your mics while our contributions are going on, and at a time when you're not actually contributing yourself. So we're going to start. And our first speaker today is Helen Phelan, who some of you will have already met, and of course many of you know. Helen is the Professor of Arts Practice at the Irish World Academy of Music and Dance in UL. She's an Irish Research Council recipient for her work on music and migration, co-founder of the female vocal ensemble Cantoral, specialising in Irish medieval chant. And she's also founder of the Singing and Social Inclusion Research Group and chair of IMBAS, the support network, of course, co-host of today, which is the support network for artistic research in Ireland. Her most recent Health Research Institute funded project explores the use of participatory arts-based methods in migrant health research. And of course, we had the pleasure today of being at the launch, or many of us had the pleasure today of being at the launch of her most recent book, The Artist in Academia, co-edited with Graham Welsh and released on just this year on Routledge. So I'd like to introduce Helen then for her response to today's proceedings.
Thank you so much, Maeve. You know, I think I'm going to be a long while digesting and processing all of the ideas, the sensations, the emotions that came up over the course of all the presentations today. But one thing I've been scribbling all day long, and one of the things I think that struck me most forcibly has been the power of this gathering. And Belinda alluded to this earlier. You know, it's extraordinarily difficult, isn't it, to create a sense of community in this virtual space. And I think many of us have been at gatherings online that do not create community and have not created community. And that reminded me of, I'm reading at the moment the incredible novel by Colin McCann, A Paragon. Some of you, I'm sure, have read it and are aware of. There's a section in the middle of it where he talks about a correspondence between Albert Einstein and Sigmund Freud. And Einstein writes to Freud and asks him, does he think that there is any way of resolving or addressing this question, the psychology of hatred? And Freud demurs for a while and says, oh, I'm overwhelmed. I don't know if I can answer that, and that's so difficult, or you might be disappointed with my answer. And Einstein presses on, and eventually Freud comes back and says, no, I don't think that we will ever completely resolve that. But, and I just want to read you this little piece here. He says, but anything that creates emotional ties between human beings can inevitably counteract war. And what has to be sought is a community of feeling. And that's what comes to me from today's gathering, a community of feeling. And from the very earliest presentations this morning, I think part of what was teased out and discussed is that the nature of that kind of community and that kind of gathering is predicated on a sense of trust, a trust that allows us, as I think Wayne so beautifully demonstrated this morning, a trust that allows us to be vulnerable in our respectful listening to each other, that insists on, as Lisa was saying, a sense of both autonomy and consensus, but also, as Kathleen says, allows us to disagree, to be angry, to rage, but to know that we are safe, that we are beyond the tyrannical silence of fear. And that to me is the kind of the community that I would like to be a part of, and that I feel I have been a part of today. And again, it made me think about, you know, a word that has come up a lot today is this question of the academy, and how sometimes that can feel like not that kind of a community. It can sometimes feel exclusive, or feel that it's something that's outside of the real world, or something that can be sometimes unwelcoming of artistry. And I love the history of words, and I started thinking about that word, of course, academy or academe. It was a person's name. Academus was Plato's friend. So there's our first hint. This kind of community that has gathered here today is based on relationship. The kind of creative academy that we are interested in is based on relationship. And Plato so loved his friend that he named his garden after him, the academy, which is where he gathered with his friends and his students, and they were brought together by a desire to seek creative wisdom. And that is what I have heard in the presentations today. And if I embrace that view of the academy, then I think the academy is in the Solstice Arts Centre. The academy is in the Wexford Opera House, the Limerick Milk Market. It is in, as Danny and as Tríona said, it is in our kitchens, it is in our living rooms, it is in our schools. This is where the academy resides, and that kind of community. I just loved some of Brian's language. It is wildly, beautifully, plurally porous. Wayne said it has to be magic. And Danny said that it has to be open to the certainty of chance. And I think that is the kind of community that we are interested in building here. And maybe Maeve, if I could just kind of finish by saying that common, relational, respectful pursuit of creative wisdom is where we come together in the space of IMBAS, and building a kind of a network that our primary goals in IMBAS, our three main goals are to create community, to share our resources and our experiences and our expertise with each other, and also to be advocates for and to help to contribute to, you know, to feel allowed to be passionate about this kind of research. And that's something that I've really welcomed in the presentations as well. People giving themselves and others the permission to be passionate, to be angry, to be sad, to be excited, and to acknowledge that as part of this pursuit of creative wisdom. And if I can give my little IMBAS ad here, it would be so wonderful. I know many of you are members of the network, but you know, I just had such a sense today of how much everybody here, our presenters and the community that is gathered, has to contribute to this question. So it would be lovely if you would just check out the website, imbas.ie, and we have a new feature where we actually have a public members opportunity, which again will allow us all to share our profiles and to get to know each other a little better. And I guess, Maeve, my final comment is picking up on, I think, a question that Matthew raised in the chat and Tríona was talking about earlier. And I'd love to hear maybe more views or conversation on this question of, you know, is there something that is distinctive about the way we are going about this kind of research in Ireland at this time? I think, of course, we are part of, and we wish to be part of, this global movement, but there are things that we also do that are distinctive. Our relationship, as has come up throughout the day, with orality, for example. Our relationship, I think, with community is quite distinctive. You know, our refusal to draw hard boundaries between the so-called amateur and the so-called professional, our interest in and our ease with the, if I could call it, the formality of informality, of humor, and the importance of being able to bring that into serious conversation. So that those are my scribbles from a very powerful day, and a great delight and honor to share it all with you. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Helen. I mean, there's lots in there, but what I want to do is get through the next two speakers so we can all kind of come back to some of those ideas which you've gathered up and also kind of pushed out as well. So our next speaker then is Olga Barry, and Olga is currently the director of Kilkenny Arts Festival. Previous roles, of course, include general manager of Crash Ensemble, the general manager of the Festival of World Cultures, manager of the RTE Concert Orchestra, and indeed festival producer at Kilkenny Arts as well. She's worked as a festival producer at New Music Dublin, and in fact, she also served, and this was referenced in earlier papers today, she worked as the project manager for the 2016 Centenary Easter Monday celebrations in Dublin. She serves on the board of Chamber Choir Ireland and Corcadorca Theatre Company. So I'd like to invite Orla now to contribute some comments and reflections and questions even on the day's proceedings.
Thanks a million, Maeve. I have to say, I feel like I'm severely underdressed at the Met Gala from today. I feel like I've turned up in my ripped jeans. I am neither an artist, a practitioner, nor an academic, but my mind is completely blown. I wish I could do this every Friday, frankly, if that could be organized. I'm in the kind of shoveling poo, if you like, end of arts administration, which can often feel like it's in conflict with this world, I think. But so the richness of the conversations from these artists, or the provocations from these artists today, have just been thrilling for me. I too have been taking notes like Helen and going, how am I going to articulate what I'm thinking in 10 minutes? But virtuosity and the authentic were very much coming through to me in the early part. My feet didn't stop moving when Tríona was doing her presentation. So I danced during one of these presentations and then was thinking about the authentic versus virtuosic. And of course, they're not versus at all. The authenticity comes through, and of course, we know virtuosity in lots of the domestic traditions. It's the authenticity that gives them the virtuosity. I'm thinking about the theatre tradition and what Brian was talking about, fixed and maybe reframed fixed ideas, the hearth, if you like, in what we call classic Irish theatre, kind of, in my view, held us back in a way, because if it wasn't the plough and the stars, what was it at all? And in some ways, we become beholden to these fixed ideas, whether it's the orality of traditional music, the language around all of that. It occurred to me when Tríona was talking about the gift of a beautiful voice. I can't even remember who the fiddler in Donegal was, but a book I read in college where the fiddler, I think it was one of the Dohertys, it might have even been Johnny Doherty, talking about going to a particular place, to a rock where the fairies gave him the tunes, because he didn't have the language to say, this came out of my own imagination. Whereas now we're obsessed with the idea of what is the imagination. So there's all of these things that have been kind of floating around. for me, autonomy, what Lisa was talking about, I'm not reading a particularly sort of weighty novel at the minute. I'm reading Maureen Gaffney's book, and she's talking your one wild and precious life. And it's kind of fascinating. It's about looking at our own background and how we get to the place emotionally that we might be at any point in our lives. And love and closeness, what Helen was talking about, that really struck me. Competency, our ambitions to be competent in our kind of adult lives, and autonomy. And exactly what Lisa said, you know, in layman's terms, the idea of autonomy is not a cold sort of self-reliance. It's actually the dependency and the confidence of our communities. And that can be our sound worlds, that can be why we go to the theatre, or why we make music in our own kitchens. So autonomy around decision making, as Lisa was describing, can be reframed any which way we like, particularly in this kind of world. I realize that I'm kind of conscious of time here, but what I wanted to say as well, for me as somebody who works in the cold-hearted business of trying to get work to the audience in a way that is authentic to the artists that drive me in my working life, that this whole day has reminded me more than anything that when artists and practitioners talk authentically about their own work and how they arrive at their work or their practice, and the importance of research driving that or informing that or helping them to reframe that, maybe pull away from the canonic ideas of art and maybe bringing us full circle back around to the idea of art, what is subversive, you know, might not actually be subversive. What we might think is subversive might actually not be subversive at all. Classical music in my world is possibly the most subversive music you can engage with, but it has been framed in a kind of way. But in my world, this whole day has reminded me about the resistance of instrumentalizing culture, our art, and our own feelings about that. And it strikes me that if everybody heard a session like today, we'd be in a very better position to resist any kind of political instrumentation of aesthetic, what we should be thinking about when we experience music, what we should be having fun with when we attend cultural events, that we should be empowered to have our own authentic relationship with everything in the world around us, be it narrative, the idea of what is virtuosic, what is authentic, what is true, what is personal, and what is political. I'll shut up now. Thanks a million, Maeve.
Thank you so much, Olga. Yeah, lots to think about there. I mean, and there's these kind of key words, I suppose, emerging throughout the day, and indeed in your kind of I won't say summary comments, but responsive comments and reactionary comments in many ways to what has happened. So things like community, virtuosity, authenticity, like all of these kinds of things. I'm sure we'll be coming back to Olga, but I'd like to introduce our third respondent now. And that is Yvonne Bonanfont. Yvonne is the head of department at of theatre at UCC and leader of the MA Theatre and Performative Practices, Performance and Activism theme. His own artistic research explores the intersection of voice and vocality, identity, touch, marginalized audiences, participation, queerdom, and interdisciplinary composition for performance. He has received funding from the IRC, the Wellcome Trust, the UK's AHRC, Arts Council England, and many others. His own work has been shown internationally and he's also published widely, and his project Resonant Tales for Children with Profound and Multiple Learning Disabilities currently runs in 4 schools. So I'd like to welcome Yvonne now to give us his reaction to and responses to today's contributions.
Thanks so much. Can you hear me? Am I there? Okay, great. Zoom is doing funny things right now, so I'm glad I'm still available. So you will hear me leafing through this sheaf of strange, messy notes while I respond, and I wrote some things down. I'm also going to respond a little bit to the last 2 respondents. So here I go. Okay, so Kathleen, a lion, biography, networks of biographical material, community of impulse and feeling, a touch of rage. Interestingly, also a link with leadership that I found really interesting, and the Clore Foundation and what it means to lead from the place of the lion while engaging with the lion-like feet, grounded in the space of the work that you're doing with that song. Wayne, space to take risks, beyond traditional approaches, questioning truths, challenging received truths, a way out of demonstrating, a way out of an actorly demonstrative approach to what performance can be. Potatoes, meaningful potatoes. That's difficult. Meaningful potatoes are difficult from a visual perspective. And I was respecting those potatoes. Objects and materiality, unexpectedness. What you raised made me think of Annette Arlander, the performances research theorist Annette Arlander's positioning of the difficulty with theater, of the juxtaposition of research and show business, and how those two things have to relate to one another sometimes. Magic as a strategy, loved that. Lisa, cultural dynamization, science as metaphor, dialogue as metaphor, conversation as science, inquiring into new methods for making, space for non-consensus, and time being stopped, questioning what autonomy means, wondering what autonomy means, dancing autonomy in dialogue, autonomy dialoguing with other autonomies. Tríona, singing, lilting, dancing, the feet of knowledge. I have a list that I wrote down, Tríona. Invisibility, complexity, interlocking, domestic, nonverbal, conceptual, embodied ecosystem. All of those things dancing with one another, and I'm seeing each of those words embedded in a shoe as someone's dancing on their feet. So we hear the dancing and the singing at the same time. Thinking about Olu Taiwo's positioning of the body as a physical journal in Nigerian traditional performance practices, and how the body is a space of writing and not just the written word, and the Yoruba suspicion of the written word as a colonial tool for knowledge generation. Elasticity. Brian, beautiful and porous, porosity, leaking, rivulets, dripping, structuring methodology, so spaces where methodology can actually capture and structure. And what I loved about that was methodology is a tool for instead of against art, because really often it's used as a hammer to beat art with. So a really interesting idea about what methods are for. Being emboldened, raising of mess. I was wondering about drawing as a choreographic practice. Actually, I was seeing drawing in the choreographic nature of those gestures. Someone else, I think, raised the idea of, or the adjective forensic, or it might have been you that raised the adjective forensic. But that tool, forensic, somehow bled for me into your use of the term reflectogram. I loved reflectogram. And I thought about how one of the potentials of artistic approaches to research is to express the results of research in metaphor instead of in logical conclusions, and how the reflectogram concept could be broadened out into a really wider array of ways of thinking about metaphor. So really inspiring for us from outside of the visual art tradition. And that map, what I really liked was the map at the end where the spectator / audience member / reader didn't know where the map was coming from. And it raised this really important issue for me, which is one of the powers art brings to the research agenda is that sometimes we can ask the reader to do the work. And that is a really different way of thinking than the Angosphere's focusing on research outcomes being about the making explicit of knowledge for other people. Because when we distill it down to a few sentences, we lose the complexity of the metaphor. Danny, so I have so many adjectives here: spaces, histories, the life accorded to sound, sonic happenings, reconstructions of interpretations, the making explicit of types of verbal history through embodying them in sound, the map of the speakers installed at the Triskel, linguistic representation and sonic representation as complementary and opposing each other sometimes, the swimmingness of voices, going back to porosity and voices dripping through the space, not just reproduction, a fantasy that you brought up for me, which I was imagining the piece going through the tannoy, and that everyone did have to listen to it all day in the space. I like the idea of if that was something they could do, and I started fantasizing about the tannoy bleeding out of the space and being in the street. How do we raise questions? And again, that presentation really made me think of Patricia Leahy's argument that one of the things that artistic research does and artistic practice can do better than other forms of expression is evoke answers rather than describe them. When the discussion was going on about whether there's a specific quality to Irish approaches to artistic research, I just want to come back to a word that was raised, which was enthralling, and respect for orality. And I think it's a really interesting context for all of the work here, even if it was not in an oral or verbal form. It was a really interesting thing about today for me. And so, I mean, it's also, I admit it, it's my personal interest. So I was thinking about the voiceness of everything today. Finally, summing all of these things up in a few lines about what may bind them together, all of this work somehow finds ways of navigating the hyper-complex world of the relationship between sensation and thinking. And sometimes politicians love to come down on art, and sometimes they don't, sometimes they really respect it. And if we're talking about art being instrumentalized, well, one of the things, unfortunately, that has happened, fortunately, anyway, universities are really instrumentalized now in practically every country. So it's really interesting to make a space inside them where the resistance to instrumentalization of artistic knowledge can thrive and grow. And think about what universities can do for art, like make space for this experimentation, make space where you can have time away from the necessary producerly, and all respect to producers, necessary producerly preoccupation with making sure the work reaches people inside a system where financial concerns are real and there and have to be met and arguments have to be made. So there's a space where people can get away from the immediate preoccupation with having to reach audiences with work. I note across the different disciplines, and I'm not the first one to note this, the really varying preoccupation with audience, and how some disciplines require a kind of thought about audience all the time and others don't, and how they also bleed back and forth into each other. And again, the terms used for audience, reader, spectator, audience, witness, participant, and how that continuum also frames how things are funded sometimes and where they go, and whether or not tickets have to be sold to them. There are all kinds of really interesting questions around who gets to experience the work and how and why. And I guess I would end my observations about today and how rich things were with a plea. And this isn't a plea because we have communitas here that Helen's really described. This isn't a plea necessarily to the body of people who are here right now who understand this. But what academic systems tend to be really bad at is recognizing the plurality of voices that make up the metaphors that art generates and the power that tactile, touch-based, haptic, reaching out and grasping you and interacting with your body power that the arts have, and the knowledge power embedded in that haptic, tactile relationship, touch relationship that the arts can have with its audiences. And right now, academia and governments are really interested in that tactile power for all kinds of reasons, because artistic approaches can knit together opposites, navigate mess. And man, are we ever in some social messes right now? And do we ever need artistic approaches to help us make our ways out of them? So my plea is for systems who are thinking of how art and academia is funded, how research is funded, how art is funded, to consider how much they need this world to get us forward in the next social steps we need to take. And thank you, everyone, for giving such concrete and wonderful examples of why art matters. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Yvonne. That was, like our other two speakers, provocative and summarizing, but also asking more questions as well. So I'm happy to take any questions from the floor. As Orla has already put in the chat, you can raise your hand and we'll actually get to hear you, which would be great. But there's a couple of, we have a couple of questions or a couple of comments, I suppose, as well, which I'll come and get to. But I might actually draw something out, Yvonne, from a phrase which you used, which is the academy, if you like, that place, and there are many places where that occurs, as Helen noted in her comments. But the relationship between sensation and thinking, which is right, the impetus, the motivation, and also the responsibility, right, in various different ways in the various contexts of academy, which we might think about. So I wonder actually, Olga, and if Olga felt like she was at the Met Gala in her torn jeans, I felt a bit like Dougal in Father Ted, wondering, Jesus, how did I get here? So I'm going to throw this over to Olga and ask her, actually, just coming from the kind of work which you do and the kind of academy which you in fact have with all of the different artists and makers that you work with, to just maybe respond to that idea of the relationship between sensation and thinking, and how you might. So how do you do that, I guess, is what I'm asking. In 10 words or less, please. Yeah.
10 words. It's a really interesting intersection, because of course I am in the middle of the public, audiences and artists, and how artists get to the point to want to make a project in a particular way. Either a lot of it is research generated, it is the outcome, and it takes a path of sorts. It is as it's not an illustration of anything, it's a practice coming out of a process of informal or formal research, if you like. And then for me, of course I get to see what the audience thinks. In almost every festival, 8 of them here, somebody at one point over the 10 days will stand up and shout their opinion about how awful the thing they've just experienced is. And I often think, gosh, like, is this Paris in 1920? You know, do they think they're at the Rite of Spring premiere? I find it fascinating, and they mostly do it in a musical context, actually. But I kind of love it at the same time, because, like, it's that thing of, if a tree falls over in the woods and no one's there, does it make a sound? Now, notwithstanding Danny being in the woods for 8 hours, this idea of intimacy between the audience and the spaces in which they encounter the end of a thing, or what we try to do more and more, is where they're experiencing an understanding of work at any point in the process for that artist. So they might be coming into a rehearsal to see 2 artists who have stripped everything back and started again. So the space that they occupy with the public, for me, is the kind of on fire moment, because that's my job, if you like. So in a way, I'm sometimes sort of going, what do they think is going on here? when I'm looking at the audience. And some people come to and they are perfectly comfortable to witness it. And other people I know will interrogate it further because they will talk to other people who've been at it, who will offer perspective. And this is the whole thing around the narrative around the arts and what we all think we're doing, both as audience and as presenters, if you like, or programmers. So, I mean, I don't know if I'm addressing what you're saying, but for me, the receiving point is inevitably what I'm living with, if you like, through my working life. But I do really believe that the more people, it's like the idea that people grow into classical music, symphonic music, because they have more time, they drink better wine. It's a real old trope, you know, that the classical music audience will never die because, you know, we just need them to be older and more middle class, and that will eventually happen to everyone. Like, that's clearly not happening anymore. But to some extent it is. Whereas my thing has always been, well, will you get more satisfaction from a Beethoven symphony if you understand the sonata form, for example, if you understand what the exposition is saying? If you're singing the tune, I think you have a different relationship with the Beethoven symphony. I just do. So how is that informed? If not in a university setting or an education setting, is it by telling people this is not some virtuosic elitist thing? It's a tune. You know, it's still something you can participate in by singing along. And maybe just that repetitive rote thing, because you like the sound world, might be your way of getting into it. But the understanding of it, like these 6 speakers, I felt entirely enriched by hearing them. Even Danny, who said he had to be cajoled by Mel, like, you know, I just love listening to Danny sort of almost not talking about his process, because it reveals so much about his process to me. So the more people have access to this, I honestly think it will give them new ways in, and will allow them to have their own relationship with the work as receivers of the work, without anybody else, including me, when we're writing program notes, telling them about the work.
Yeah, Helen, do you want to kind of come in on that as well? And so kind of that idea of sensation and thinking, and then what happens, if you like. And you, I suppose, you know, cited S rather than C in different kinds of academies too, in your own work, in your own professional life. So do you want to respond to that idea about the relationship between sensation and thinking, and how we might make that more, I guess?
Yeah, thanks, Maeve. And I think maybe I'm picking up a little bit on both what Yvonne and Olga was saying, because in terms of the kind of the sensations and the ideas, the third kind of leg of the stool for me is also the kind of emotions, you know, those 2 definitions of feelings, like the physiology of feeling and the affectiveness of feeling. And I think it's almost like the triangulation of the 3 of those that is the space in which our work is happening. I'm really, you know, when we're talking about kind of things that are distinctive, one of the things I've been working on a little bit recently is our kind of historical, methodological, mathematical obsession with tripleism, and this as a kind of a construct that can help us perhaps overcome these kind of binaries of theory and practice, and of the academy and the artistry. So I think there's something there in looking at those 3 elements. But what occurs to me when I was listening to Yvonne and Olga is that we work with very powerful tools, don't we? You know, that's part of what has made this day so powerful, is because we were in the hands of expert alchemists, you know, people who know their craft and are able to yield their magic and mesmerize us all. And we know how to create an experience. But here's the other thing we also know, that part of the success of doing that is to create an illusion, you know, to throw the dust, because we also know that in behind all that is infrastructure and structure. There are people building sets, and there are curtains. You know, the very event today, you know, involved like hours and hours of sweat and tears from Orla and Mel and from Erin and from Nell to make this happen. And that's the the structural piece, which is, I think, part, Olga, of what you're getting at there, you know, like how do we make those powerful, magical experiences sustainable, and how do we communicate those? And that's, so I think that we also need to yield that magic on, if I could put it, the more mundane elements of what allows us to make our craft communicate. And some of that has to do with the kind of structures that we work within. I get very preoccupied with these whole questions of sustainability. You know, we create an experience today, we all feel empowered by it. Then we go away, we enjoy our weekend, we wake up on Monday morning and we're back struggling with funding and with research applications and with trying to build the bridges between all of these different worlds. And that's a big question for me today. How do we sustain these things? So I'm a big believer in bringing those powerful tools to building structures and designing policies, because, you know, as banal as they may sound, I think we can work our magic on them. And part of that is about, you know, thinking of structures as puzzles. Somebody once said to me, you know, there are often two kinds of builders. It was an architect. There are the empire builders and the bridge builders. And the empire builders are very interested in creating their own world, you know, and imbuing that with power. The bridge builders are interested in the creative, sustainable structures that allow us to move back and forth. And so that I think is if I can just kind of tie that up, bringing together what Yvonne was saying about the power of our tools, of our sensations, our emotions, and our thoughts, which we've seen demonstrated over and over in every presentation today, but to bring that to bear on the kinds of questions I think that Olga is raising, which is, you know, like, who is our community? Who are the participants, the audiences, the witnesses, the artists, and what kind of structures and policies allow us to sustain that conversation?
Thanks, Helen. And I suppose as well, and I'd rather like, I'm drawing back the curtain slightly here, because the Wizard of Oz himself, Mel, has indicated that I should perhaps bring in Wayne here, if he'd like to respond or comment to this. And in particular, that idea of sensation and thinking, or indeed magic and structure, if you like. So Wayne, have you any particular response to that?
You're asking me about bringing magic to structures, is it?
Yeah, and just, I suppose that yes, and that idea of the relationship between the two and how those are enacted, if you like, or not, as the case may be.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of think something that I came to realize over the last few years is that the way a thing is organized is what the thing is. Mm-hmm. So, like, as much as anything else is, like, the structures that we work within are the structures that we support, you know. And so I think we have to think very, it's kind of like the way Donna Haraway would talk about, you know, it matters what ideas we think our thoughts with. Like, our associations are important. And rather than talking about kind of things from the top down and complaining, I think it's really important to think about how we build ourselves up, like what associations we make and how we are with other people. I mean, you know, some of the most creative people I've ever worked with have been producers. And in a country where we don't really have a strong dramaturgical tradition, they have been some of the greatest dramaturgs that I've ever worked with. So it isn't a case that I find in my work that I move from the artistic to kind of talking to the help or something. Like, that's not really like how it works, you know. Like, everybody that I work with is part of making the thing. And increasingly, you know, I mean, things shifted in the kind of practice that I was doing in Prague, where roles were less defined and people were moving across borders, and that was kind of enriching and exciting. And I think things here are a little bit more everything here is more structured than it was, or like, I think also Ireland, in some ways, everything has to do with money, because there's just not enough money for the arts here. Like there's 6 times, like I think if we increased it by like 6 times, it would still be at the minimum for Europe. So it's a total scandal, the environment we're living in. So as much as we can talk about what we can do in spaces, until they give us more money, we're starving. But like, no, I kind of lost my train of thought there. But in the Czech Republic, where it was cheaper to live, you could live a more experimental life, and so you could create structures and work inside them. So I feel that we're in a slightly difficult bind here in the kind of intensely neoliberal society that Ireland's becoming, and we don't have a lot of help or a very strong voice collectively, even though there are extraordinary people working in the arts. But yeah, I mean, I completely agree with Helen. I think that we have a lot to bring to bear to the way in which we organize, to the way in which we organize ourselves, and the way in which we are creative about organizing. I was thinking earlier on today about, someone was mentioning education and arts, I think at the end of the session that I was involved in. And I was thinking a lot about like, you know, we think so much about like scientific thinking and business thinking and psychological thinking. And I really would love if we lived in a culture where people really took art thinking seriously in their own lives, not just artists thinking, but the ways in which we can be creative, and not just create, because creativity is a word that is involved in lots of forms or ways of being, but specifically kind of art thinking metaphorically, as Yvonne said. And the power of the metaphor, which is real, unlike the simile. Like, my heart is a stone. You know, somebody just said, what other countries support the arts? I'm aware that lots of people have difficulties in all countries, but most of the countries in Europe support the arts fiscally much more than Ireland does.
Thank you very much, Wayne. I'm going to actually ask Kathleen to come in now as well. I think Kathleen had wanted to contribute as well. So you can unmute, Kathleen, and come in there.
Thanks, Maeve. Yeah, it just occurred to me, the community musician in me, as you're talking about structures there, that I think one of the most radical things that we can do in terms of thinking about structures is to really push that idea of valuing the participation in the arts right from the very beginning of the lifespan, and seeing all citizens as innately creative. And I mean, I think I've thought about it and I've written about it, that, you know, that one of the very first things that happened in the pandemic is that people went out onto their balconies and sang to each other. Because when all other possibilities of connecting were taken away, we had to find something to connect, and we did it that way. And so I think that, you know, maybe that's one of the most radical things we can do as artists, as well, as to remind people of that, and to recognize the value of creativity, not in its economic value, but its human value, that it is essential to human life, and then by establishing that, I think we push the structures to follow suit, because once you value something in that way, that it is essential to living, then policy and education and funding have no choice to follow suit. But yeah, so that's the community musician's response from me.
Thank you, Kathleen. And I suppose, so I don't think anybody would disagree with that, particularly in this forum, but the challenges of that then are, you know, are real, and what lots and lots of people here today are grappling with in whatever academy in which they're operating. Tríona, Shíocháin, Tríona, you'd like to come in there.
Thanks, Maeve. Just really to support what Kathleen was saying, and I suppose just another angle of that same issue is that societal transition has had a profound impact on traditional performing arts in Ireland and all over the world. And when we think about structure, you know, I suppose there would be structures at governmental level, or the various structures that are put in place to support the arts. But there is also larger political questions about how our social world is structured. And many of the creative practices that I mentioned earlier today existed in a very very different socio-political world. And I often used to say to students when I'd be talking to them about, you know, immersive creative practice and so forth, I'd say, well, let's just imagine for a minute that, you know, you're working in an office and you're lilting the entire time. Unfortunately, somebody would tell you to shut up, or your boss would have to call you in and say, I'm sorry now, but we have a problem with the incessant lilting in the workplace. In one of the classes as well, there were mature students who had worked on building sites in London. And so, you know, we were talking about the singing practices in those situations. And they were saying that with health and safety, that singing became restricted as a practice, even though we know that there are really important traditional repertoires there in that sector. And I suppose I just wanted to mention that as well, just with the issue of structure, I suppose, you know, when you think of kind of governmentalized contexts or the sort of panopticism that seems to govern workplaces, our world has become very silent in a way that is schismatic if you look at it with a longer historical view. It's a sort of existence that is entirely new, in fact. And I would have deep concerns about how human lives are being structured in such a way that the creative moments that used to be ubiquitous are being squeezed out of existence. This in turn has a profound impact on the richness of, you know, aesthetic understanding, techniques, repertoires, and things like that. But it's something that is going under the radar. I give a paper on this to the Economy and Society Summer School a number of years ago called Singing for Social Theory, to make the point that the absence of the socially embedded everyday creative practices is actually incredibly serious for humans. Okay.
Thank you, Tríona. Our work, I mean, that idea that our world has been silenced, I mean, I think can be extrapolated out into other, you know, related and connected kind of spaces as well. So it's not just been silenced, but perhaps it's been also cohered and rigidized, if that's a word, I've no idea. I think that's really, really interesting, and is actually, I think, really related to everything that people have been talking about today. If we look at a kind of a macro idea of the idea of research and practice, in fact, being, you know, all together, right? And so there's been a kind of a heretofore known schism created between those two spaces, and really what lots of people are doing today is saying, oh, actually, there isn't a difference, or there isn't a split, that in fact that both of those things are knitted together. We have a couple of comments that I wanted to get back to then as well. Mary McCarthy asks, where or what are the artistic approaches that navigate mess? You know, that this is a really interesting idea, something which came up in a couple of the presentations today as well, and indeed in discussion. And certainly our speakers, our contributing speakers might speak to that, but also if anybody else wants to come in on that. So what are the artistic approaches that navigate mess? I think, will I go to Yvonne first to see if you want to respond to that in any way?
Sure. Well, I'll depend on your artistic approach. I think I have written about the navigation of mess from a vocalic perspective in a book chapter, but I think pretty much, you know, in my view, I think the theatrical paradigm is a really good one for thinking about the navigation of mess for all of the reasons that have been mentioned here before. Just because if you think of a standard, you know, devised performance making process, you know, or a typical one, you get in a room with a bunch of people, and like has been mentioned today, things crystallize and concretize, and method comes into play, but it's very often, to quote Baz Kershaw, that people are navigating the creative process from hunches. They're starting with hunches, and the hunches are like these diving boards that they dive off of into these messy groups of impulses and intentions and collaborative drives and people flirting with each other and people not flirting with each other and all kinds of the mess of relationship, really. And I think everyone here could probably talk about how their work moves between mess and not mess, and that moments of not mess emerge and then they plunge back into mess, in the sense of not thinking about method for a while, and then method somehow coming back again for a while. And I really agree with Wayne that one of the delights of working with creative producers who have creative in the producer land is they're really great at noticing with an outside eye when the mess can come out of mess for a little while and then go back into it again, and what those moments of not mess can be inside the mess. I think that is also really culturally specific. If you've read Robert Lepage, the Québécois director Robert Lepage, talk about working in the UK, the US, and Quebec, and comparing those three things, where he, in Quebec, he has a terrible time stopping people from improvising, like channeling people out of improvisation. But, in Quebec for a long time, we had a TV show where people improvised theater sports on TV. Like, it's sort of just in the culture. And then he compared that to London, where he had these extremely professional actors who he felt he had to coach for 3 days to get them to improvise before he could get. But the polish was, really incredible. So I think there are cultural questions around mess. I finished this long discourse sort of not answering the question by saying that yesterday, so this messy answer, and look behind me here. So yesterday I was preparing some of our master's students for today who haven't had exposure to methodological questions before. And I paraphrased Gertrude Stein in Everybody's Autobiography, and I trucked this out. Some of you have heard me truck this out before, so my apologies for the repetition, but which is also very Gertrude Stein, the repetition. But there's a great moment in Everybody's Autobiography where she says, "My writing is as clear as mud, but out of mud run rivulets of clear water that braid together into a stream." And so often it's that braiding together into a stream that we're navigating here in context. And I think every presentation today showed us movement between mud and stream. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Yvonne. I know that Orla wants to come in there, but can I just throw this to Olga first, in fact? So as you were speaking then, Yvonne, as well, I was really thinking about Danny's presentation and, the idea of uncertainty. And of course, mess and uncertainty are, very much tied together, right? Or can be tied together, at least, depending upon how one thinks of mess. Right. Olga, did you want to come in on the back of that then as well? That idea of that idea of mess and the artistic approaches to that, if you like. Yeah. Not presuming mess is a problem, by the way. I suppose that's the starting point, isn't it?
I think absolutely it is, because the reaction to that in somebody witnessing that can be as profound as something very structured. I just from recent experience seeing medicine, it's an unresolved, Enda Walsh is kind of, a piece of theatre that you don't really know what's going on, and it's highly structured in the production of it, of course. It's wonderfully written and beautifully acted and all of that. It's a highly produced piece of work. But Enda is very honest about what it's unresolved for him. It's unresolved for the audience. So it's up to you to decide where is the messiness actually, or what do you think has really, really happened? The thing that I'm thinking about the mess is back to Brian's idea of fixed subjectivity, not subjectivity. Tríona was talking there. I don't want to go around off the loop, but I think it'll explain itself. Tríona's thing about how our worlds have changed and like almost the legislating of our way of being, lilting in the workplace. When I was working in RTE, the HSA accidentally made orchestral music illegal, according you know, and like we weren't the first country that this happened to. The BBC orchestras had the same thing, and we knew this was coming because, of course, if the BBC do it, RTE have to do, but you know, we don't have concert halls of the size to do symphonic repertoire. So basically, you know, putting orchestral players up on stilts to be away from each other for noise legislation, because it's all built around the workplace. But when did orchestras become about the workplace? Well, because they became employees. We're in a country where we only have 2 bands that are employed, like compared to, say, somewhere like, you know, somebody was asking what country does do the arts properly. Denmark has, you know, many multiples of fully funded orchestras with the same population as we have. So there's one example for, you know, as an example. So accidentally making lilting illegal because it's a chained workplace, a formal orchestra with employment conditions, now it were briefly illegal. So all of those, so it's not a fixed thing. Again, Paul Morley speaks brilliantly about realizing that classical music is much more subversive than the rock and roll he wrote about for NME for 30 years. Those things and that fixed idea. So messiness is a construct in our own receiving mind as well. So like a chaotic piece of dance for me might say much more to me because of the absence of narrative entirely, because I might be a person who finds I'm always seeking narrative, but if I'm allowed to actually disable myself, if you like, of that idea of a fixed construct that contemporary dance has to say something to me, maybe I can just revel in the messiness of its physical beauty. Or like what Wayne was talking about, maybe I can just think about that potato or be in the same space as Wayne and that potato and take a different, change all my fixed ideas about everything, including messiness.
Mm.
Does that make a kind of...
Yes, it's a little messy, but that's what we I know I want to bring Aileen and Delan in because there's a whole thing happening in the chat, which you may be following along there. But before that, I'd like to actually ask Wayne to come back in. I think Wayne had some responses to our conversation.
Yeah, I did. I mean, maybe we move forward, but because I was thinking about mess maybe in a slightly different, way. I was thinking about like the mess we're all in, maybe, and I was thinking about the title of. I mean, I'm not to mention Donna Haraway twice now. It's not like she's my favorite or anything, but I was thinking about staying with the trouble, the idea of staying with the trouble, and like living in the ruins, and like one of the things that attracted me so much to Czech culture was its history from the communist era of DIY and of repurposing things and of hobbies and of kind of creating from a very limited set of resources and making really kind of extraordinary things. I think it's not that we shouldn't produce anything, but in some ways you're kind of like, we could stop producing so much and look at what we have. And I guess Latour has that like compositionist manifesto, like, and look at how we can compose with what is already around us. I mean, I don't have a kind of hard line on that, but I do think, and certainly I do a lot of teaching, and the younger generation, those with an artistic bent, I'm sure there's still yuppies, but like those with an artistic bent, you know, they're interested in like simple things and connection and touch, and they don't have the same feelings around excellence or power. You know, they have a very different positioning, and I would be very hopeful that when those people step into their power, and when we allow them to, and support them in that, and collaborate with them and learn from them, and so on, that perhaps there is the possibility of a real shift in all our works and the way in which we organize our work, so that we can live with some of the mess, and maybe even enjoy a bit of it. You know?
Yeah, I think the latter being the key, isn't it? I mean, we're all living with the mess anyway, right? And so it is that we, you know, that we have a comfort with that we enjoy that uncertainty, as Danny has described in some way, in a related way for me at least. Aileen, that's no problem. Aileen has a response, but I want to go to Lisa, actually.
Hi, how you doing? Thanks a million. I'm just responding to some of the stuff that's in the chat as well as the conversation. So
Yeah.
I'm all for messy research. As a dancer, that is what we do. And I know, you know, Olga, you mentioned that, but I came to language very late. So everything comes from the body, from response from that. So I'd say dancers in general, we process things through our bodies first and language comes later. So messy research is where it's all at. But I just want to respond to, so Aileen's made some fantastic, I know Aileen, you can jump in and speak for yourself, but just I suppose being in the Arts Council, one of the things we need people to really vocalize the value on the outside. And I think that's what the NCFA is doing amazingly. It's great to see Praxis as well coming out. And one of the things I think that artists continuously do is by making work better and better and better and better, is that is one way of doing it, and it's an amazing way of doing it, especially in the academy. People make these incredible contributions, but it's then getting it out and getting them seen and getting them read and getting them heard. And I think there's a politeness around that. I think there's a kind of, oh, maybe it's not good enough, maybe that's why it's not getting seen or read or heard. But I do think, especially around the arts community, it's a small community, but it needs to get more vocal. And I think, you know, that confidence that you can bring to say, look, we need this everywhere. We need it in schools. We need to be taught more in schools so that there's a literacy around people, what people are watching, that we go to see more things. I am so sick of Netflix and it's amazing. So now that I'm actually going to see performances again, I'm drinking it in. And like, I can feel that in my body missed live performances. So now that I'm sitting and watching things again, it's like, you know, I'm like a sponge. So, you know, the way we can support it on so many ways, the Academy can support it by really using that research to make a tidal wave. We can go and see everything that's on, we can read, and then we need to put pressure on our government to keep funding. So we've got a funding, you know, we're at a benchmark high of, we've never been here before, 130 million. It was incredibly hard to get that 130 million out because the infrastructures aren't always there to support it. But I do think that it needs to be something that, rather than just making it better and better and better, it's also about louder and louder and louder. That's all I have to say.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for that. We have a little bit of time left. If anybody has any particular questions or comments, feel free to either put them in the chat or indeed to raise your hand. But I suppose one of the things, and I think it's, you know, coming out of all of the discussions today, but also what we've just been talking about, and that is the kind of again, I keep seeming to come back to this idea of relationships, right? Because in many ways, all of today was about relationships, both on a macro level and indeed a micro level as well. But the relationship between kind of community and autonomy. So throughout the day, there was lots of reflections, if you like, on ideas of community and indeed autonomy then as well. So Helen, I might bring you in on that just to maybe respond to, in the scheme of the whole day's discussions, that idea of community and autonomy and how that's resolved. And of course, I say resolved, which suggests that there's a tension, right? And perhaps you'll disabuse me of that notion to begin.
Thanks, Maeve. Yeah, as I was listening to the conversation, and indeed, as you said, those kind of pushes and pulls in between those different points of view, as you said, whether it's, you know, autonomy and community or messiness and structure and all those. I was thinking something that I often come back to, because I'm interested in singing, I'm interested in the way the voice works, but I'm also interested in the phenomenon of migration, you know, and this whole reality of the world we're living in. You know, we've never ever had so many people on the move. And I often think of this principle of physics, which was actually first articulated by an Irish man called Boyle's Law, which we use in singing. You know, when you fill up a space and you increase it to a point of maximum pressure, then it has to collapse and push out what's there. And then in that more relaxed space, it builds up again. And it's a really good metaphor for migration as well. And I was struck by it. I was thinking of it as we were talking, Maeve, about the pushes and the pulls, the points of pressure, the release. And I was wondering, you know, is this something that happens organically, or is this something that we can creatively play with? And I was thinking about the point that Tríona was making earlier, you know, the squeeze, how the everyday presentation and action with the arts is being squeezed out. And what are the kinds of things we do to elbow our way back to build up that space? You know, this is something that I'm really interested in terms of like new migrant communities, you know, people in the asylum seeking process who are quite deliberately politically excluded from society. And so often you see that artistic practices are the way that people elbow their way in and create space for themselves. So I don't have an answer to your question directly, Maeve, except to say that I don't think, and I don't think anybody's suggesting this indeed, I don't think we can sit back and hope that that kind of organic push and pull will happen. I think we have a role to play. We have a role to play, you know, as Wayne was saying earlier, to try to you know, make our case for an artistic way of thinking and living. You know, as Kathleen was saying, to continue to make the point about the creativity and the artistry as a characteristic of citizenship, and to, you know, in that rebalancing, then to engage creatively in the work we do, and to bring that creativity on all these structural questions of pay and of wages, and the way in which we can build this kind of sustainable relationship. So I think we have a role to play there, and to bring all of those aspects that we keep pulsing back to today, you know, the power of sensation, of ideas, of emotion, to bring all those to bear on these kinds of questions. We have work to do.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Helen. I'm not sure if Olga or Yvonne want to come in on the tail end of that to Helen's remarks there. Olga.
I'll just say one final thing. I sit on the steering committee of NCFA, and I do see a kind of, I feel like we were slipping behind for so long, for like a generation, if you like, and that idea of giving voice as a sector, which is fraught with difficulty because it's such a diverse thing to try to capture. And you know, the pandemic certainly exposed that. Like, it is not possible for every part of the community to speak with a single voice, just as possible. But what the NCFA and the sector widely through that kind of network has been doing is that direct engagement with politicians, things like putting the arts back into education fully, STEAM, not STEM. It feels like we've been saying it for 20 years. Like, why did it leave in the first place? You know, would be kind of my thing. You know, our equivalent citizens in Northern Ireland have a far more, you know, structured music education, which allows them that kind of alternative leaping point, because they have a structure in the first place embedded in, like, choral education, for example, that we no longer have I think, proper structure. And now music generation is trying to recreate that, and in some cases very successfully, because it's in the community. So maybe it will be better. But I think back to what Martin Hayes said just before the pandemic at a Culture Ireland, Global Ireland kind of thinking that was really kind of very frustrating for the sector, which had been for a decade being cut from the lowest base in Europe, as Wayne said. And Martin Hayes, in that lovely sort of high thinking, like, if practice ever is the living, breathing version of research, it's Martin Hayes's fiddle playing, and gets to sit there in a room full of politicians and is looking at the stats, and we're all sort of, literally putting our hair on fire for 10 years, saying, what government is going to understand how they're destroying our society, not just our sector? And Martin casually says, I'm looking at this, and the whole campaign at the time was to double the funding for the Arts Council as part of, the overall national campaign. And he said, geez, doubling, that's ridiculous. Like, it should be 13-fold to just be average. Sure, wouldn't it be great to be average? And for the first time, the roof lifted off that whole thinking, because this is the space we're at. We're kind of trying to, through artists' work and producers' work and festival work and music generation, we're trying to cobble it all together, as Wayne said. So we don't even have the space to be messy in some cases, because sometimes you might lose a grant for being messy as a presenting festival, for example, you know. So all of that makes me totally agree with what Helen is saying. We have to find some way to sort of empower the power behind what the sector has. And that's my, you know, as an NCFA steering committee member, what goes on in the background and getting things like UBI, universal basic income, even on the table, takes huge amount of us all speaking up for the sector politically as well as personally.
Thank you, Olga. Yvonne, I'm not sure if you wanted to come in there or not.
I could say something brief. You know, I've only lived in Ireland for 3 years, and half of that time has been under lockdown. So I'm some of my I'm naive, and there are a lot of people I haven't yet met and a lot of people I don't know. What I would say though is, you know, I live in Cork, and according to European Union stats, this city is the city of its size in the European Union with the highest density of cultural activity for a city of its size. That includes cities rolling in cultural money like Innsbruck, for example, you know. So I think that the taste and interest in what the arts can do is very profound. I think with my outside eye, like to some degree insider outsider eye at this point, what's interesting to me is that sometimes when governments throw money at the arts, it is also not what it appears. So, and it's not, I'm not saying that because I think government shouldn't throw money at the arts. Don't get me wrong. Like, I think financing should be good financing. It's more that, you know, when Quebec, when I was in my 20s, really enhanced under the Parti Québécois funding for the arts, they pretty much exclusively invested in digital production. And there was actually an economic goal, which was to attract software companies to city center Montreal, and they did it. So the arts were used in an extremely instrumentalist way in that sense. That funding was not for art. It was actually for economic gain. So I think what's wonderful about what my co-panelists are advocating for here is that it's also really important that the touch quality and the heart of what art is remains in why the funding is produced. Because sometimes governments can cosmetically produce funding, but they're not actually funding. And what I would, and I think that's what's so great about what the NCFA is doing, is keeping the heart of why art matters. And Helen, you also expressed a really interesting, I don't know if you did this on purpose, but for me, you expressed also a point about what the arts in academia can do, because we are in very privileged positions to have salaries as academics and to not be struggling for our pennies. And there are things that we can afford to do with artistic research that other people can't afford to do because of our positions, like really be able to focus on questions of the arts being a space for integration, because we don't have to immediately put bums on seats of ticket sales in our positions. And that's a huge privilege for us. And I would encourage everyone at this meeting, I would remind you that the government is currently doing a public consultation on what research money should fund. You've noticed that there are, radio ads about this consultation. And we also really need to get in there from the research end and ensure that we are advocating for research money to go to art too. So that there's an ecology of research, of arts council support, of basic income support, that those ecologies really nourish each other. And I think there's enormous potential for that to happen. Because of course, research discourses in the general public are all about, well, let's invent the new drug for X, or let's get a cure for X, right? But when people get exposed to events like today, sometimes they are enticed by the magic of what artistic research can do. And that enticing is wonderful, right? That's that. Thanks.
Thank you, Yvonne. So I'm going to have our last contribution, just Aileen Delan. I'm going to draw her in now. And I'd actually, I'd also like to wrap up some of the comments. Now, there was lots and lots of comments coming in. We didn't get to all of them directly, but perhaps in your country, because I'm not going to preempt what you're going to say, Aileen, but you might, if there's space in there, just quickly respond to a comment and a question from Mary McCarthy, which was just asking about what helps with seeing new eyes and listening with new ears in the arts, and how is that related to thought? And in fact, much of your own commentary was in fact dealing with that, I think, in the chat. So, and I'm conscious of time, and don't worry, we'll be out of here by about 5:01. Okay.
Okay. So I don't want to kind of bring a downer to all of this, but as my friends in Chicago often say, you know, we're preaching to the converted here. We've all drunk the Kool-Aid. We're all invested in this and we all believe in it. And everything that Yvonne had just said in terms of the leveraging of arts, we're often complicit in things we don't even realize, particularly with the traditional arts, which can become part of a, you know, a right-wing neoliberal government soft diplomacy effort. And because we get funded, we think we're doing great. So I think we have to be extraordinarily cautious about the manner in which we become involved in funded work because of the nature of the types of deliverables that are expected from us. Not that we can't find ways to be quite subversive within that, I think we can. And the other thing I really wanted to say is that as artists, you know, in many ways, the establishment doesn't appreciate you and doesn't want you because you are critical and because you point out things that, you know, policy doesn't want to deal with. And so, again, we have to be those critical citizens to very much find ways to navigate and find ways to find the spaces between officialdom and the kinds of things we want to do to make a better society, because regardless of EU calls for funding, what they say they want, it's not often that straightforward. And I'd echo Helen's point that as anybody who's in a tenured position with a salary should absolutely try to apply for research funding that guides policy, because that is one of the few spaces where we can make impact. But another space we can make impact is in our local communities, and possibly using socialist models of microfinancing, of becoming part of communities that are not doing mainstream professionalized arts practice, but are actually about something much more on the ground. So those are just some of the things I wanted to say. And in terms of new eyes and listening, you know what, also go to the young folk, go on TikTok, you know, see, I can be so cynical. I have 3 boys who kind of, you know, do stuff online and constantly online and go play your banjo, but they always come back to me with some sort of surprising way that they have made interventions creatively. So I think keeping oneself young and you know, going to places and going to things that are not within our comfort zones is critical. It's crucial. So that's my answer to Mary. Thank you,
Aileen. And I'm just going to hand over now for the final wrap up to Mel Mercier. I'd like to thank everybody for their contributions to this panel, of which I was chair, but also, of course, throughout the day. And it was a delight for me to be involved. So thank you very much. So Mel, you're on the floor.
Thank you very much, Maeve. Thank you to Maeve and to Olga and to Helen and Yvonne and Orla for that wonderful, wonderful session. I'm going to take 2 minutes to do a very important thing, and that is to thank a few people. And I'm going to begin by thanking if there are such things as the gods of connectivity, because with all this talk of messiness and things, one thing I'm really happy about is that the gods of connectivity were not messing with us today. And so I think we've gotten through this relatively unscathed. But of course, there's good reasons for that as well, because we've had a wonderful team of people putting the event together and working behind the scenes throughout the day and indeed in the weeks and in some cases in the months up to this. So at the top of my thank you list is Orla Tracy, who is our research assistant, who has been toing and froing with all of the participants and has done remarkable work. And indeed, her work is not finished yet. So there will be follow-on after this, but thank you very much, Orla. I also need, in the context of funding and all that, to mention also again that we're very grateful to the IRC and the New Foundations Award for supporting this project. Also great gratitude to Belinda and Fiona and Nell at the Solstice Arts Centre, who came on board with us as partners in our application to New Foundations and came on board with IMBAS. And thanks also very much to Helen Phelan and all of the steering group on IMBAS. Our colleagues in the Irish World Academy who've been with us today in the background, acting as belt and braces and support, particularly Alan and Aaron and Jennifer De Bruin there as well, our co-hosts. If you'd like to find out more about IMBAS, you can get onto the IMBAS website, imbas.ie, and you find out a bit more about about IMBAS. And if you're interested in signing up, we'd be delighted. There is a possibility now of becoming a member there. Thanks to everybody for attending and for all the participation. It really has been a moment of relationship building, I think, and that's the fantastic outcome of all of this for me. We must get together again. And I think that we're definitely looking ahead to other events as well, and so we will keep you informed of that. And finally, I want to thank the participants, all of whom have been extraordinarily generous in taking up the invitations and responding to the invitations and preparing presentations and responses, and taking the time and the care around all of the presentations. And to end with, I really would like to name all of them here. And now this is a risky thing, because the last time I made a list of people at the end of a concert, I had everyone on the list, but somehow or other I skipped somebody when I was reading them. But anyway, forgive me if I've already forgotten you. But anyway, here we go. Thank you so much to Kathleen Turner, to Wayne Jordan, to Lisa McLoughlin, to Aileen Deland, to Helen Phelan, to Yvonne Bonanfont, to Olga Barry, Graham Welch, Belinda Quirk, Tríona Shíocháin, Brian Fay, Danny McCarthy, Maeve Ní Orthán, Kevin McNally, and Fiona Bulger. Thank you so much for really a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful day. And just to end up then, I'd like to encourage maybe everybody in the room to maybe, if you can, put on your video. One of the things I find most difficult about the Zoom thing is that it's very hard to say goodbye. It's hard to say goodbye well, and it's kind of anti-goodbye well technology. So if you'd like to pop on your video there and open your microphone, and let's just give each other a wave and wish each other very well. And I hope to see you all again soon. And please open your microphone and say goodbye. And
bye. Bye, everyone. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Bye, 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 bye. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks for everything. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.